Welcome, friends, to Breakfast in the Ruins, a Michael Moorcock flavoured podcast. A wee while back, I made plans to record our first Oswald Bastable themed episode, as my chosen interlocutor, Robert, was visiting Bradford for a few days, so it afforded us the opportunity to, number one, meet up in person, two, introduce him to some of the sights, sounds, smells and tastes of Bradford, and three, record in person the first episode of a deep dive into the Warlord of the Air. Well, as things went down, I took a copy to the Netherlands with me to reacquaint myself with something I probably haven't read for over 20 years, and my dad, unable to sleep on a night whilst we were away, bemoaned the fact that he didn't take a book with him, so I gave him Warlord of the Air and he rattled through it in 2 sittings. Absolutely loved it, so now I've sent him the whole trilogy. But the downside of what was an excellent weekend spent drinking and commemorating the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Arnhem in Operation Market Garden in 1944, alongside a coachload of old airborne veterans, was that Phil and I came home with a rampant dose of COVID-19, putting something of a dint in our plans with Robert. Fortunately, I tested negative just before his departure date, so we hastily made plans to meet up for coffee and, being a content whore, I took a microphone along so we could record a chinwag. So, in this interstitial episode, I meet up with our long-standing patron and friend Robert MacMillan in a coffee shop in Bradford to set the scene for our journey into the worlds of Bastable. And it's probably a good job we went this route, by planning or otherwise, because we rattled on for a good hour without even getting into any of the real detail of the Nomad of Time series. As well as Moorcock, we talk about coach holidays to Palamos in the 1980s, VHS tracking, Bond, Who conventions, Pontins Prestatyn, the literary merits of Lawrence Durrell, and all sorts of other things. We recorded this in a busy coffee shop in Bradford on a Sunday morning, and, unfortunately, my microphone and mic technique were hopelessly inadequate to the environment, so it sounds a bit crap, although it's only via the incredible science behind plugins that this recording was even salvageable. So, big props to Wave Clarity VX for that. Still, you live and learn, and I enjoyed this conversation too much to simply abandon it. It has taught me, though, that should we record in a similar fashion in the future, I probably need to invest in some new gear appropriate to that kind of scenario. Anyway, all that aside, grab a refreshing glass of Ackroyd's Vortex water and join us in Derry and Tom's on the road as we take a hearty repast in the heart of Bradford and talk about, well, all sorts really. Right, so this is a sort of special instance of Breakfast in the Ruins because I'm with Robert MacMillan. Welcome, Robert, to Bradford, number one.
Thank you very much. It's also a special occasion because we're actually having breakfast.
Yes, very true.
That might be a first on Breakfast in the Ruins.
Yeah, I'll have to think of a clever title, aren't I? Breakfast with Robert Brackets in the Ruins. I don't know. Oh, and to be fair, we are in Cafe Nero in Bradford and someone's wrecked the front door.
That's right, speaking of ruins.
So, fair enough. This is, in a way, a special episode because the original plan was Robert came to Bradford to stay for several days and we were going to meet up, we were going to go for booze and pies and curries, and we were going to record a podcast on Warlord of the Air, and then Phil and I came back from Arnhem and brought Dutch COVID back with us, which was something of a disaster. So we're now on Robert's final day where he's got to work an epic 14-hour stretch in his day job, but we're managing to crowbar in an early breakfast. So here we are.
It is a pleasure to be in Bradford. It's a pleasure to be on Breakfast in the Ruins.
It's a pleasure to have you. Oh, that flat white is delicious. So, I think we just peaked a little bit there, but you know what? I will dial it down ever so slightly.
There we go.
Yeah, I don't know why this mic is so hot, because the gain is only at about something low. Anyway.
I'm going to try to keep my soothing journalist's anchor voice on the radio.
Yeah.
Traffic and weather together on the twos.
Yeah. Whereas I'm absolutely incapable of suppressing any kind of surprise or eeks or moments of excitement.
Perfect.
It's simply not in my nature. Anyway, it is always, what do we do when we have a new guest on Breakfast in the Ruins? Well, of course, we ask them what their history is with genre fiction and Moorcock in particular. And I know that you have a a fairly lengthy history with Moorcock, and you actually just touched on it just before we walked in here when we were waiting for the coffee shop to open.
That's right. My discovery of Moorcock's works began in the summer of 1987. I was 13 years old, about to turn 14, and I was desperate to leave the United States after my completion of the 8th grade. And my mother, who's from Germany and who had come to America in the late 1950s, had come with an older sister who in the early 80s decided that she wanted to move back to Germany. And so she was living in the town of Tübingen, which is outside Stuttgart. And she was either teaching on or affiliated with the university faculty, I think, as a psychologist. And she had 3 kids who were more or less my age. And because I was desperate to go somewhere, my parents devised the idea that perhaps I could spend the summer with my Aunt Isa. Mm-hmm. So I went over with my mother. My mother left me there after 2 weeks or so. And I spent the rest of the summer in this kind of parentless Arcadia. My cousin Mark, 3 years older than I am, he was a dungeon master for AD&D. Yeah. He still is. And in fact, he still plays with the same people with whom he was playing in the 80s. Yeah. They're in Australia now and various other places, but they still get together once a month and they continue their campaign. Yeah. I never understood D&D, and I tried to work with it, but I usually just sat around watching them and not quite understanding what those die were doing. Yeah. So I spent a lot of time looking through his book collection and reading his massive collection of science fiction and fantasy and horror books. Mm-hmm. And I came across a book called Warlord of the Air. Excuse me, it wasn't the Warlord of the Air, it was the omnibus edition by, is it Grafton?
Yeah, no, I'm out of the time streams.
It was called, oh dear. I looked at the book just before I came
blue binding
over here. It was the blue binding with the image of the airship. Yeah. And it was called the Nomad of Time.
Nomad of Time. Yeah.
That's what it was.
That wonderful Melvin painting on the cover, which is a little bit abstract.
Yes. Yeah. And I was intrigued by the cover, but what caught me was the very short blurb on the back of the jacket that said it was 1903. That was the first thing that caught my attention. I thought, that's a funny year for science fiction. Mm. My second thought was, it mentions dirigibles, zeppelins, and it mentions a British Army officer who discovers something crazy in the Himalayas. Yeah. So I thought, I don't know, this it doesn't sound like the usual kind of thing that my mother was pushing on me, which at the time would have been Lord of the Rings, some Roger Zelazny, Lord of Light. Mom liked Asimov quite a bit, and Heinlein, Stranger in a Strange Land. Yeah. This didn't look like any of that. And I started reading, and I was captured. And if I may continue for just one moment, I'll skip to after I finished that book. But later that year, I was able to go on a school trip through my school in New Jersey. Our history teacher was from Yorkshire. In fact, she was from York. She arranged a coach trip for us to go to England and Scotland. Mm. I brought over a gray duffel bag that had plenty of room with all my clothes and everything still in it. The duffel was almost as long as I was. I overstuffed this poor thing nearly to bursting because we went into some bookstore in London. I discovered that they had more Michael Moorcock books than I had any idea existed. And I bought them all. Yeah. I bought them all by cashing an American Express traveler's check. And I had to hump this bag to Oxford, to Harrogate, to York, to Edinburgh, and to Glasgow. And it was ridiculous. And I mean, at one point, the teacher said, Robert, don't you think you should get a new bag? And I said, no, I'm fine with this one. So I came back with Castle Brass, and the Hawk Moon books. I think was it 6 of them altogether over 2 volumes. 4.
4 in the first one, History of the Room Staff. 3 in the second.
I bought all the Coram books, which my cousin also had. Yeah. I bought Breakfast in the Ruins. I bought Behold the Man, Cornelius, which at the time that was the 4 books. In America later, they published 2 more that had 2 each. They had the Alchemist Question and the Una Persson Catherine Cornelius collection in one book, and then Lives and Times, and another one in the second book.
Yep.
And I stuffed myself. That was my trip to England, and I came back, and I read up on my Moorcock.
Yeah.
Then I let him go, oddly enough, sometime in the 90s during my university years. But when I came across your podcast, that's when I started reading them all again.
Oh, how incredibly gratifying. And you know what? It's not unusual to get that feedback on the podcast. There are a handful of people who listen to the podcast because they've come into it via things like the role-playing game angle, which we occasionally do. Like, we've done like 91 or 92 episodes now, and I would say probably 70 of them are Moorcock focused, but as you know, we've talked about Crabs books.
Well, so Night of the Crabs has been a particular favorite, not just with me, but with others around me. I've given it to all of them, and I've used the tagline on the back of the book, right? A seafood salad for the strongest stomachs. It's just brilliant.
Yeah. And we'll be back to Guy and Smith with our Halloween special very shortly, but no crabs on this occasion, no crabs. So, you know, as a child, you pick up all these Moorcock books, you lug them around the UK and Europe. You had your big gap. What did you go on to read in post-Moorcock?
Ballard. That's when I discovered Empire of the Sun, first as the movie. I was working in a video store later in high school, and so I found the film, which led me to the book. But of course, that book led me very quickly to the Atrocity exhibition and to Crash, which when Cronenberg put his movie out, I was really disappointed because it couldn't find distribution in America because of all the sex. Of course, the funny thing is I was expecting some erotic hit, but I should have known better because it was Ballard. When I finally saw the film, I thought, well, that's about the most sex I've ever seen in a film that really just isn't sexy.
Yeah.
Nonetheless, I still...
Ballard and it's Cronenberg.
Right? I mean, it's my kind of drink. It's basically like straight Campari. It's all bitter, you know? I thought Ballard, was just a master. I spent a lot of time reading just whatever I could get my hands on. I own a home in the Azores, which used to belong to my grandparents, who bought it after they emigrated from Germany to the United States. They used to stuff whatever English book they could find on the island. At the time, there weren't many. They used to stuff all those books into the house. And so I would read anything. I would read Cold Comfort Farm, Pasteur Nouveau, Maigret mysteries, old editions of Cosmopolitan magazine, if that's all there was on hand. The New Yorker editions. But what was I really sticking with on a more consistent basis? Well, during the pandemic, I read the essays of Michel de Montaigne, which was just nutty. I'm going to have to read them again because I understood about quarter of what he was saying.
For a dopey Northern Englishman like me, you're going to have to explain who that is. His
adult years were a little bit before the time of Shakespeare, and he was a Southern French member of the nobility, I think he was. I don't remember if he was nobility or just some kind of elevated gentry, but he wrote in his room, in his middle years, a series of essays on this, that, and everything. And they can be very abstruse, very esoteric, and at the same time, they can be very down to earth and funny.
Yeah.
And he just wrote about absolutely everything. He was a wit, he was sarcastic. He wrote an incredible travel journal of his trip from France to Rome via the spas of Germany, because he was looking for treatment for his kidney stones, which he plagued him all his life. And so in his diary, he writes these very deep things about the Catholic Church and about the evil reformers of the Protestants. And then in the next sentence, will describe the look and feel and amount of the stones he had passed on a particular day. It's absolutely, you need to read the travel journal. It's really quite good. I read my way over those years through all of Iris Murdoch's novels. They really caught my attention. I went back and read all my Stephen King books again and figured out which ones are good and which ones were not. There's a few good ones, and just anything on hand. Faulkner, Ursula Le Guin, T.H. White and the Once and Future King, The Sword and the Stone. I mean, just all over the place, anything I could get.
Yeah. I think it's one of the peculiar things about being a reader. I can remember holidays where, when I was 12 years old or whatever, we went on holiday to Spain, to a place called Palamos. This is back in the 80s when all of a sudden cheap holidays in Spain where you travelled by coach for 30 hours So a family of 4 or 5 would pile on a coach. You would travel 30 hours. The driver would put on like a really terrible pirate copy of E.T. There was a tiny portable black and white television screen at the front of the bus. Which is the first time I ever saw E.T. was on a bus in the late 80s.
Do you remember there used to be a little dial on the VHS and the beta recorders and the players
For tracking.
That's what I forgot what it was called, but they would, because you get waves.
Yeah, that's right. And it's remarkable now when you see, you get all these whiz kids on YouTube who create video content, and some of them will they'll figure out a way to actually put a filter on something to make it look like it's off VHS, and they include tracking lines, even with the little indicator in the bottom right, which on the more advanced VHS players, when you played with the tracking wheel, you would actually get a little indicator on the screen of the tracking. Amazing what kids are capable of doing when they're going retro these days.
May we digress on that for just one moment?
We can digress as much as you want.
I'll keep this short.
Yeah.
I'm editing right now a series of interview transcripts by this avant-garde musician, originally from Newcastle, but now living in Estonia. His name is Andrew Mackenzie, and one or two of your listeners might know his longtime act, which was called the Hafler Trio, which at one point consisted of 2 people and a fake third person. Now it's 1 person. And that second person was Chris Watson. If anybody likes Cabaret Voltaire, he was part of that.
Yeah.
And now he makes these award-winning BBC production sound designs of nature documentaries and other things. Anyway, Andrew he's a master of manipulating sound and form in analog fashion. He knows his digital very well too, but analog is how he made a lot of his very strange Hafler Trio records and CDs and whatnot in the 80s and 90s. And he talks in one of the interviews I'm editing about this phenomenon of retrofitting analog noise and irregularity into digital productions, and without trying to reduce his thoughts on that, which I'll probably do incorrectly, he does bemoan to some extent this idea that digital should be this reigning medium of perfection, which in a sense is imperfect because it's either on or off, right? You can't manipulate and twist and pull and like taffy the way you could with tape. It sort of bemoans this idea that you would then go and add artificial imperfections to create an effect. But I would argue that Paul McCartney did this on Honey Pie in 1968 on the White Album, when he added the record scratch to make the song sound old, right? As well as compressing the vocals or whatever the word is, so that he sounded like he was on an old pre-hi-fi mono phonograph. I think that those things, they're a little bit hokey. They're rather silly. When you have perfection, why rub it with things? But think about what the next generation, their children are going to do with technology like that. Those artificial imperfections, in a sense, will end up being an embryo that I think will lead to some other kind of artistic expression that we simply haven't thought of, or some method of delivering it that might produce something we just haven't found yet and will be very entertaining or interesting.
I think that's one of the problems. I say problem. It's one of the interesting things about where we sit in terms of culture and creativity right now, is that because not only are we at one of those stages where, a lot of people who listen to music say, well, everything's been done, everything's getting recycled, there's nothing really new. But we're also at an intriguing point in time where if anything you want to do, you can do in your bedroom with software and plugins, to the point where, you just made that point about Paul McCartney on the White Album. If you go on Audition or any digital audio workstation, or even just apps on phones for recording, or even sometimes microphones with built-in settings, you will have built-in settings or an app or a plugin that will make you sound like you're on a vintage radio in the 1940s, or broadcast quality, or, I've got a plugin for Audition which will add that gentle vinyl hum and scratch. It's all there because people want it and people want to use it. And when people are creating things, they don't want to create things that look digitally perfect or anything else. So we were in Arnhem last weekend. I took a lot of photographs. I dug out my old Panasonic Lumix G2 camera, which Phil got me years ago, DSLR camera, all the settings under the sun, for a professional photographer. Me, I haven't got a fucking clue. I look at all the little dials and all the switches, and I open the screen and look at all the settings, and I'm like, I'm completely lost. But it's got a button on it that says IA, and it lights up blue when you press it, and it automates everything, so you can use it as a point-and-click camera. I bought a flat, what they call a pancake lens, so you could just use it pretty much as an Instamatic, and it takes up less space in my bag. I'm sure these lenses have much more advanced scientific purposes for photographers than what I use it for. But whenever we go on holiday, I take it, I snap away, and it just takes photographs that, whilst my phone takes wonderful, sharp, digital photographs with incredible reproduction, I took some photographs and I sent them to a friend of mine, Gemma, and she said, "Oh, what fantastic photographs. Was there a professional photographer there?" And I was like, ha, 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 no, but this camera is so smart that it can make even an idiot like me take great photographs. But the quality of the photographs that differentiates it from digital photography with a phone or an iPhone or anything else is there's an inarguable but subtle quality to it. I think they call it bokeh, B-O-K-E-H, when you have a large lens which gets plenty of sunlight in, adds depth to the image, and you get focus. So not everything is in focus. That wonderful photographic quality that you only get from a camera.
You made me think of two things.
Oh,
Number one, when I was shooting on film, which I still do from time to time, I had a camera at one point that had all those settings in the same way where I thought, I have no idea how to use these. I've always told myself that there's really only two things to remember.
Yeah.
Which is, at least with film, one is remember the speed of your film, push or pull back as necessary.
Yeah.
And remember that you have an f-stop. And the f-stop is your aperture, right? And if you want a wide depth of field, you turn it in one direction. If you want a narrow depth where you don't have all that background out of focus, turn it in the other direction.
Yeah.
I did everything on those principles. And I think aside from using infrared film, which is a whole different science, the only thing that would ever steer me wrong would be my artistic decision to take a crap photo. Because in the end, this is really what's important is you're trying to get across an image of something you've seen with your own eyes rather than something that you've manipulated into being spooky or ethereal or whatever. So point and shoot. Point and shoot, it relies on the most important instrument of all and the most difficult effect of all, which is the talent and the eye of the photographer.
Yeah. Gemma.
And the second thing I have to say, just imagine one day when we're dead, if the basic flat effect of us recording in a digital medium becomes an effect of its own to somebody else somewhere down the way. This is how it sounded in 2024.
Yeah, it sounded like
when people were just doing normal stuff.
Yeah, Gemma sent me a message saying, and she referred to the triangle when she was talking about the stuff she'd learned about photography because she'd done a photography course. I was like, the triangle, ? And she sent me a little image and there was aperture, light out. I can't remember what the 3 points of the triangle were. And instantly I became the Zach Galifianakis meme with all the graphs and numbers flashing around. I was like, no, I've got my blue button. I've got my blue button. But going briefly back to coaches to Spain, being a reader.
Yes.
So after watching this brainy ET video and probably other things like the black hole or whatever they were.
Maximilian Schell.
Yeah, which I fucking love the black hole.
My father took me to see it. We had a good time.
Oh, the bit where Maximilian, the robot, shreds Anthony Perkins' chest in the book.
That was a hard one for me.
You just do not get that in kids' movies anymore, do you?
No.
And that was a Disney movie.
No, you don't. Well. I saw that in Moonraker in the same year, and it was an experience.
Yeah. I really regret not seeing Moonraker at the cinema.
My father took me. Texas.
Because to this day, and I will fight anybody on this, Moonraker is my favourite James Bond film, but it's only a fraction. It's a hair above On Her Majesty's Secret Service.
It's a great movie.
And I acknowledge the flaws in both. One of the flaws that people most frequently ascribe to On Her Majesty's Secret Service is George Lazenby being a terrible Bond. But I think
he doesn't bother me a bit.
Brilliant Bond.
He doesn't bother me at all.
I think he's wonderful. He looks great physically. He's fantastic. He looks amazing. He doesn't. There are a couple of hokey bits of script where he winks at the camera that don't quite work in the way that Sean Connery did. But otherwise, that's almost a perfect movie.
But he has that great line. This never happened to the other fellow.
Yeah, it does. I think that's a wonderful movie. But for me, Moonraker has such a special place in my heart. And it's still the case to this day. The day I got it on Blu-ray and could watch it on a ginormous telly, I was absolutely delighted. I think there are two films that when I got a 50-inch telly and got them on Blu-ray and watched them, filled me with so much joy and gave me goosebumps for slightly different reasons. One is the Hawkman attack scene in Flash Gordon with the Killer Queen soundtrack, the rocking soundtrack.
And Brian Blessed.
Yeah, when Voltan is invading the rocket ship. Absolutely incredible. To this day, just thinking about that gives me goosebumps because I remember seeing it in the cinema and it blew my fucking mind as a kid. And it still blows my mind now. It's wonderful. All those years of watching films in pan and scan on TV or on VHS, and then the day that came out on DVD in full widescreen, and all of the image was revealed that you'd never seen since the cinema, all of that production design, incredible.
I saw Blue Velvet finally in a proper aspect ratio after not knowing it was being panned and scanned. I didn't know anything about that sort of thing until it all was revealed.
Yeah.
And there's a scene in Blue Velvet, which there's no point in going into it, but there's a scene in that movie where these two guys in a hardware store play a little harmless joke on Kyle MacLachlan's character Jeffrey. In the pan and scan, you don't know that they're even in the frame.
Yeah.
And so I used to think it was just Lynch being weird.
Yeah.
No, it made perfect sense.
Yeah.
If you add the parts of the film that are missing.
Yeah.
Coach to Spain.
Yeah.
You were saying.
Yeah.
Old films.
So, the other film, so after Flash Gordon, the other film, to this day, if I put it on Blu-ray, and I have the same experience when I watched it on DVD for the first time, if I put Moonraker on a 50-inch telly, Spy Who Loved Me to similar, but to a slightly lesser extent. But the space battle scene in Moonraker, where the American astronauts start drifting out of the airlock, and that space march scene music starts to build.
That's right.
And you know what's coming. In all the years of science fiction movies that we've had, with all the special effects and all the technology that we've got now, nobody has ever done an astronaut versus astronaut with laser guns space scene.
No, I don't think so. And I haven't seen them all, but I don't recall seeing something.
And that space scene, to this day, is fucking incredible.
Yeah.
It's all model work. Obviously, it's all pre-CGI. And it has that classic sense that Bond movies went through for a very brief period of time because everybody was honed on war movies, that The Spy Who Loved Me and Moonraker at the end just become war movies.
They are. That's right.
With come on, lads, good guys dying, bad guys dying, left, right, and centre. Huge human cost to the action and drama. Not just Bond wiping out a million bad guys, a broad kind of threat of cost. And, the end of Spy Who Loved Me is kind of like watching A Bridge Too Far, but on an oil tanker.
And from around the same time, both films were made, if I remember correctly.
That's right, yeah. And Moonraker is very similar. And, of course, both directed by Lewis Gilbert, who's directed a whole host of movies, but also war movies, directed Sink the Bismarck and various other things.
And then that other one came out with Roger Moore, speaking of North Sea.
North Sea Hijack.
And Anthony Perkins and James Mason, right?
Yeah.
I don't know how to pronounce the double F. Is it just Folks?
I don't know.
Whatever his name was.
Yeah.
But I thought for the Bond films, they got the battle thing. I thought they got it down better. They finally made it work from my tastes.
Yeah.
In the next one, in For Your Eyes Only, when they reduce the number of people and it's not some huge campaign, that in fact it's a bunch of scrappy Greeks, on top of that, in that monastery up above that cliff. And it's really shot with a more, I don't know if the budget was more modest, but it's a little more intimate and human focused rather than people on a chessboard, so to speak. And it's just got that great scene where he throws away the MacGuffin, and so of course his opposite number in the KGB can't have it. And I think all the KGB guy does is smiles and he gives you the shrug, like, what can you do? And see you later. This whole movie really led up to this. I really enjoyed it.
It's got that wonderful, very, very Bond money shot as well, where he kicks the car off the cliff with a shrug. Which I remember reading that Roger Moore Roger Moore really didn't want to do that because he didn't think it was Bond. It wasn't his Bond, but actually it was the most Bond thing that Roger Moore's Bond had ever done.
It was definitely a Bond moment in the Ian Fleming mold.
Yeah. So those movies, this is one of the things when we discuss a variety of different things that we end up going down various rabbit holes, but going back to Spain, the anecdote, being a reader is that, we'll watch these movies on the coach, we get to Spain. I've probably taken half a dozen Target Doctor Who books because I'm off the page. But we're over there. In the first 4 days, as a kid, I wasn't into lazing around on the beach. I was bored very, very quickly. So I've read all my Target Doctor Who books. I think my mum was reading Shikasta by Doris Lessing.
I read that. Yeah.
So I tried that, couldn't get into it.
It's hard.
Yeah, couldn't get into it at all. My sister was reading a Naya Marsh mystery novel. So I remember reading that, and I distinctly remember accidentally dropping it in a rock pool, and it got absolutely soaked, and I destroyed my sister's copy of a Naya Marsh book. She wasn't very happy with me.
They must have had millions of them, never used book. I guess there are so many English shops.
Yeah. You don't really see Naya Marsh in second-hand shops anymore, but you used to all the time. Naya Marsh was like the Moorcock of mystery novels.
When I was a kid, those books were available in my local bookstore.
Yeah. I've only thought
next to Agatha Christie.
Yeah, I've never even thought of Naya Marsh for 30 years, but she just suddenly popped in my head just talking about this. But in the second week we were there, so after 1 week, we're walking down a street in Palamos, and I look across the road, and I see a guy, skinny guy, glasses, beard, sitting at a bar. The bar was called the Frankfurter König.
Of course it was.
Yeah, in Palamos. And he waved. I was like, holy shit, that's my English teacher. I'd just left junior school and gone to senior school, and he was my English teacher from the previous year, a guy called Neil Simmons. And I waved back. And to cut a long story short, he was staying in the same apartment complex as us. He'd arrived the week before us and somehow managed to not cross paths with him at all up until that point. But I ended up spending a good portion of the following week just getting pissed with my English teacher. And he gave me half a dozen P.G. Wodehouse books to read.
Oh, well.
So my introduction to P.G. Wodehouse was accidentally bumping into my old English teacher in Palamos. And I wasn't drinking beer, but the funny thing was they wouldn't serve me beer, but they would serve me martini, rosso, and tonic.
Because certain things are necessities.
Booze for kids.
Yeah, that's right.
So I spent the week drinking rosso and tonic, playing pool with it, and talking about P.G. Wodehouse. And it's just one of those things about being a reader. It's like, right, I've run out of my Target Doctor Who books. What else is there? Right, Shikasta didn't work for me. Naya Marsh, read it. P.G. Wodehouse. So I think I read 4 Jeeves books, Smith in the City, and there was something else. I think it might have been Blanding's Castle, something like that. And all of a sudden, I was like hooked on P.G. Wodehouse for a year or two. And it's just one of those things about being a reader. It's like sometimes it's just whatever floats by your line of sight, and you just grab it, and off down a massive rabbit hole you go for several years. The great things about being a reader, isn't it?
I did it with Durrell and the Alexandria Quartet and the Avignon Quintet, and it all came to a halt when I tried to read his book it was sort of about robotics and artificial intelligence, but from the late 60s, and all the ideas were really interesting, and just 2 books in the series. They were such shit. I couldn't believe that a world-renowned author was such a crappy writer, just terrible in humor, and I thought, how come you wrote all these other really lovely books about travel and about the war and about Alexandria, Egypt, and then you wrote these and somebody published them? That's fascinating to me. I'm a member, by the way, of the International Lawrence Durrell Society, and if anybody from that society should hear me saying this, just calm down.
Yeah.
They're crap books, and that's indisputable.
Right, Lawrence Durrell, My Family and Other Animals.
That was Gerald.
Gerald,
his brother.
Right.
And if you watch the Durrells in Corfu, you get an idea of who everybody is on television.
Yeah. I remember my mum having that book. Pre it being on TV, I remember my mum always had books on the go.
The Gerald books are very big in India. When I was in India working, you could see Gerald Durrell and James Herriot, and who's that other one? Oh, and Woodhouse.
Yeah.
He was every bookstore I went to in India. They had the complete editions of all of this stuff.
Yeah.
All next to the Mills and Boone, romance, bodice rippers.
Yeah. Oh, speaking of Woodhouse,
do you have a bodice ripper?
I think I might have read a Barbara Cartland at one point for similar reasons, just because it was there and I couldn't get my hands on anything else.
For me, it was a few years ago during the pandemic. I was out of books and the library was closed, the public library down the street.
Yeah.
And all I could find was a Danielle Steele book.
Well, why not?
I nailed it in 3 days.
Yeah.
I was quite, and there was a Clive Barker novel. I read my first Clive Barker novel.
Yeah.
I have no plans to read another one. It was the shittiest book. I don't understand. And he, by the way, is very, he and Stephen King both talk about their writing ability and tell other people how to write, but I notice that they often don't follow their advice. And Barker, I read this book by him called Galilee.
Yeah.
I mean, read it if you just, it's like, I don't know. It's like reading some weird, vaguely homosexual version of Mandingo.
Right.
I mean, it was awful and overheated and southern swampy gothic in every possible way. But I thought, it's the pandemic.
Yeah.
I'll read what I have.
Yeah.
Anyway.
I tried Weave World, I think twice. I wanted, my mate, I can't remember which friend it was, but in the 90s, I had a friend who was like, "You've got to read Weave World. You've got to read Weave World." And I don't think he was a massive fantasy and science fiction fan, but he was one of these people who were a reader, and he would read Stephen King, and he loved Clive Barker. So he repeatedly recommended Weave World to me. And one day I thought, okay, let's give it a go. I picked it up from a second-hand shop. I think I've tried twice. I just couldn't get on with it.
Yeah, it's how I felt about watching Hellraiser. I wanted to like it.
Yeah.
I just couldn't get into it.
Oh, I love Hellraiser really for two reasons. One is I love Andrew Robinson. I can watch him in anything. I think he's wonderful and he's incredible in that film. And I also love hideous gloopy practical special effects.
And you see, it's also been 30 years since I watched it.
Yeah.
So it's probably time to revisit.
And I can't remember the actress's name, but...
Claire something.
Yeah. But yeah, she plays Andrew Robinson's wife. And her performance in it is brilliant.
Yeah.
It is wonderful. Sequels.
And it's savagery at the caravan.
Yes.
You know, I mean, it's a genre.
Yeah.
And in fact, we almost come back to Night of the Crabs.
Yeah. Night of the Crabs.
What if we had a, how do you pronounce the name of the holiday camp? Is it Butlins?
Yeah.
We should come up with a shaggy dog, gory horror, sex crazed, drug addled monster series set at various Butlins. It'd be like the Road to movies with Hope and Crosby, but featuring Butlins.
You know, sometimes
and monsters.
Those places are 90% of the way to be in a horror story, even
all
without
by themselves.
Yeah.
I saw a Doctor Who episode set at a holiday camp, and I thought, I hated it the first time I saw it, but when I saw it as an adult, I thought, oh, I see I see what they're doing here. Yeah. It's actually quite clever.
Yeah. Well, anecdote. Back in, I'm guessing this was the early 2000s, my mate Rich, he won tickets through SFX magazine to the SFX Weekender. And this was the first time I'd ever been to a holiday camp. He won tickets. All we had to do was, did he win accommodation as well, or did we have to pay for accommodation? I can't remember. But anyway, we went to the SFX Weekender at Pontins Prestatyn. So Pontins is the other big Butlins type holiday camp company in the UK. There are a few others now. But Pontins Prestatyn, North Wales. And we went along, and our first impressions were pulled up in the car park, and there were people all over the place dressed as Wookiees, stormtroopers. There were Daleks trundling up and down.
It's your usual convention.
Yeah. So we were like, wow, this is interesting. This is actually quite cool. This has cost us nothing. Brilliant. So we found our accommodation. We went round, and the accommodation blocks at Pontins Prestatyn, when you pulled up at them, looked like an East German re-education camp from 1962.
And I've been to East Germany, so I know what you're talking about.
They're all absolutely identical, like blocks. We went in, and the accommodation, it had that. I've only ever come across this type of carpet once before, and it was in a budget hotel in France, where it almost looks like AstroTurf. And if you were to scuff your knee on it, you would bleed. Yeah. Like really hard wearing, intended to never ever wear out.
It's there to discourage hanky-panky.
Yeah, very probably. The beds were single beds. The sheets and the quilts were folded up roughly and left on the beds. It looked like a bar-built bedroom. And the fridge, the salad compartment at the bottom, Rich took it out and tipped out a load of 2 inches of grey water because it had been empty for so long. All the condensation had gathered in this salad drawer and just turned grey. We turned the heating on. The fuse tripped, so we had no power. And the only furniture was a 2-seat sofa that was upholstered in similar stuff to the carpet, and 2 moulded plastic chairs that looked like from a school assembly hall circa 1965. It was terrible.
How grey was my valley?
Yeah. The food was terrible. The food outlets were terrible. It was a horrific place. And after we got, I mean, the actual event itself was pretty good. You know, you had various ex-Doctor Who's there, and it was 2000 AD. At that point, I think it was 2000 AD's 30th or 35th birthday or something. So we met John Wagner and Carlos Esquire and had to drink with them in the bar, which was fantastic. So it was all really good on that front. But Pontins Prestatyn itself, 90% horror show before you even introduce any overt horror elements. And one day we thought we've got to get off site and find some good food. So we went into Rill, which is just a couple of miles up the road from Prestatyn. And we love rundown holiday resorts, which are like faded Victorian glamour. Rill, if you're into that kind of thing, oh my word.
The hotel I'm staying in right now fits the bill.
Yeah. A couple of them in Bradford. Yeah. And just an incredible place. We turned left off the main drag to drive up a street to loop back to head back to Prestatyn. And it was a street of probably what were former guest houses. The entire street, 100 yards from one end to the other, was all steel shuttered.
Oh,
it was
sad. I'm so
the most depressing yet weirdly wonderful place.
You have made me think of two more things, which I must say, and I apologize to your audience for taking you somewhere northwest of science fiction.
Yeah.
But number one, well, now it's all going out in my head. Number two, you made me think of something by the by. Doctor Who conventions.
Yeah.
My father indulged me.
Oh, nice.
He took me to them when I was in the midst of my heat. And I had all those Target books.
Yeah.
I had them all up to Fury from the Deep,
yeah.
I think, which was the so-called bumper edition. They failed to edit it, you know, and so it turned out to be longer than the other books, which I appreciated at the time. I went to so many of these in the United States, and I can tell your listeners, although many of them probably already know, who were the most memorable actors I met, and actors and other crew members from that show. And I would just say for the moment, Katie Manning, who played Jill Grant, was the sweetest, most delightful, charming person who had time for everybody and didn't have to worry about pushing you off because there was somebody else's book to sign. Mm-hmm. She had a conversation with me and my father that had nothing to do with science fiction. We talked about they talked about having children and places that they've been on vacation, and she was the sweetest person. She's on Twitter now, called X, and she's still doing her thing. Yeah. And I just want to say, if anybody knows her or has ever spoken with her, she's lovely, she's wonderful, she's great. I met Janet Fielding, who played Tegan Jovanka.
Oh, one of my crushes in the 80s.
Yeah, as she was for me. She was one of those people who would walk by you very quickly at the convention and say, yes, very nice. I have no time. No. Okay. Anthony Ainley was very sweet. Yeah. He gave the master smile all the time. It was a bit of a shtick. At the same time, I appreciated it. I also must say I saw Patrick Troughton just maybe weeks before he died. Yeah. In America, he wasn't looking too well, but he was very kind. Tom Baker pretended to be nice for a few seconds, but he had a huge line of people who were up for book signings. Good on him that he continues to, I think he's continuing to act to this day. He must be in his 90s by now. Yeah. And finally, I took a group photo with me, Colin Baker, and John Nathan Turner. And it was before I knew anything of what they used to say about John Nathan Turner offset with him and boys my age. Yeah. But I must say, I found his eagerness to put his arm around me and the position of his hand to be remarkably forward. Mm. But I didn't think anything of it in those days because it wasn't an issue in the same way. Yeah. But I do remember feeling, well, very much affection from JNT or TNT, as I believe they call him. Right. But you know what? Say what you will about him. He was the man behind producing The Caves of Androzani, which I thought was a fantastic episode. And by the way, learning about that guy, Sharaz Jek, Christopher Gable was the actor and the dancer who played him. That's what actually made me discover Ken Russell films. Yeah. Which just, it all came from wondering who this guy was and where else did he appear. Yeah, and Peter Davison himself said, had it all been as good as The Caves of Androzani, he never would have packed the job in. Yeah, unfortunately, they made Planet of Fire, which, you know, I'm all for, you know, having a sort of a homosexual metaphor for an episode, but I mean, you could say that about all of Doctor Who. But Planet of Fire was, I mean, even the title is kind of a nod and a wink.
Yeah.
Come on.
Yeah.
You know.
I think I'd largely given up on Doctor Who by a certain point. I don't think I ever watched Caves of Androzani live.
I stopped with Trial of a Time Lord.
Yes.
And because it was failing, even if it had Michael Jason, who was wonderful in Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. It wasn't working.
Yeah.
And they didn't know what they wanted to do, and you can tell it shows. It's all done it's all an edit job. Yeah. And I never went back. My brother watches all the new stuff. I haven't been interested.
I'd gone maybe 50-50 at a point, because I remember watching Attack of the Cybermen at my friend's house. And
wasn't the worst.
It wasn't the worst, but they got to a point where they were putting comedic music cues in, which were just horrendous.
Boing.
Yeah, it was terrible. It was terrible.
Yeah.
And, I'd given up by that point. But the whole convention scene is a really interesting one, because I think there was one year we went to one in Sheffield, because, to cut a long story short, after we went to that one at Pontins Prestatyn, the following year, another one of us won tickets, and we just paid for accommodation. It was in a different part of North Wales in a much nicer holiday camp. And going back to Pontins Prestatyn, about 2 months after we got back, my mate Rich, I was at Yark, I can't remember, messaged me and said, I'm watching Holiday on the Buses. And it was filmed at Pontins Prestatyn.
Okay.
And it hasn't changed.
Oh.
It looks exactly the same on screen in Holiday on the Buses, the film. It was incredible. So we ended up going to these things regularly, and there was, I think, my favourite one when it came to meeting people, because we ended up going back. One year we entered the Sci-Fi Weekender quiz and won it, just on the strength of me and Yaki being massive fucking nerds. So we won the complete package for the following year, and then we just ended up going fairly regularly. And one year we went to one in Sheffield, and it was to coincide with the release of the Flash Gordon documentary about Sam J. Jones.
Yeah.
So we met Sam J. Jones, we met Brian Blessed, and James Cosmo, the guy who played Meryn Tramp in Game of Thrones, who was the horrific paedophile Kingsguard.
Oh, yes.
Irish actor. What a wonderful guy. He was so lovely. But Phil got a signed photo of him saying to Andy from Meryn Tramp. It's just a bit weird.
I will say about Game of Thrones, by the way, that I hesitated to watch that for a very long time, because I have an inherent distrust of shows that are hits.
Yeah.
Particularly when they're sword and sorcery. Because I just don't trust that my friends, as much as I love them, who are not into the same kind of things that you and I are into, I don't trust their quality meter or their quality radar, whatever it might be, for gauging these things. But I was wrong. Game of Thrones was just a romp. It was delightful fun. And then people who do like what I like, they said, well, you must have seen where it made that terrible left turn and never recovered. That last season was terrible. You shouldn't even watch it. Oh, come on. I don't care. You know what? You can throw plot holes at me that are as large as the Ring Nebula. Yeah. I don't care. I had fun. I had fun watching Diana Rigg do her thing. I had fun watching Jonathan Pryce chew the scenery. I had fun watching Charles Dance get what was coming to him on the toilet. I loved watching. I'd heard about Sibel Kekili, the former, porn actress who became a mainstream actress, the Turkish German woman. She was wonderful. I mean, everybody, Peter Dinklage. It was like I said, it was a romp, and I love a romp.
Yeah. It was good fun. Yep. It was good fun.
Oh, so may I ask you a question about Michael Moorcock?
Sure.
I've been thinking about this as we've been talking, and it seems that for you, for me, and for many of your regular characters on your show, and as well as some of your guests, American and otherwise, that he is always this kind of he is sold in a mainstream sense, but every one of us who has found him always seems to find him in a way that's vaguely not underground, but through a byway rather than a main highway.
Yeah.
Not like Stephen King, in other words. Was there a time in England, or Britain, I should say, or in Europe, when he would have been in the contemporary conversation, in the zeitgeist, like the way Kingsley Amis might have been at some point, or the way that Anthony Burgess might have been at some point, or Muriel Spark. Did that ever happen with him?
I think he touched on that. I think Moorcock had two distinct avenues into people in the 60s and 70s. One, I think, because of the 60s boom in science fiction and fantasy, where every bookshop was stacking huge amounts.
There was a market for it.
There was a huge market for it. But not only that, when we were kids, and this is, I suppose, incidentally, you would go into a newsagent's and there would be paperbacks on spinner racks.
Oh, that's right, yes.
And so that's where I would see Sven Hassel books, Corgi Sven Hassel books, because they were hugely popular. You just got them in newsagents. But a lot of fantasy and science fiction and horror, New English Library books like Guy Smith, James Herbert, were all huge sellers. So from a pure commercial aspect, I think there's a very good reason why if you go in a good second-hand bookshop in the UK these days, you'll still find a dozen 60s or 70s Moorcock editions, because they must have been produced in vast numbers.
Because it seems to me, and I'll interrupt you for just one moment, it seems to me that when I think about reading his books in order, it seems that in the early 60s, when he was already doing his editing work, right, in the magazines and writing some of the early stuff like The Winds of Limbo or Blood Red Game or whatever it was called originally. I mean, I've read those books, and I mean, they're really terrible. What I appreciate about them is the effort. I mean, he's clearly full of ideas and full of the joy of writing, even if it doesn't work in certain cases. But by the time he would have been doing, late 60s, early 70s, Cornelius and all the rest, I guess it seems to me that he might have been riding a wave of general interest in the genre, then bending it to some extent. But tell me if I'm wrong. It seems to me that by the time his writing really matured, and I'm talking about mid to late 70s and into about the late 80s, the sad thing, it seems to me, is like he finally started writing with a certain grave, ironic reserve, also more economy than he used to use. Then his plotting and pacing became better. But it seems like that would have been around the same time that the sales might have started to ebb, or at least that audience interests might have turned in other directions. Am I vaguely
you're
correct?
absolutely spot on. And in the late 70s, at the point where Condition of Music, for example, wins the Guardian Fiction Prize. So in the 70s, Moorcock is getting reviewed in broadsheets by passionate fans who were, part of like the cultural mainstream when it comes to reviews and actually highlighting these things. So he's getting that recognition in the 70s. Condition of Music wins the Guardian Fiction Prize. I think, was it Mother London gets shortlisted for the Whitbread Prize or the Booker Prize? I can't remember which one.
It was, I think, it might have been short or long lists. I don't remember, but I do remember when the book came out.
But you're absolutely right. At that point, I think he has passed beyond all of the Grafton / Panther editions. So your edition of Warlord of the Nomad of Time is part of that wave of 80s reprints. Grafton Panther, the Elric stories are getting reprinted either in Panther or Grafton editions or in the States by Daw in new, revised, chronological series.
Daw's the one that I have.
Yeah, so there's still a big market for them, but I think the huge 60s and 70s boom of pulp genre books is probably starting to fade off by that point. And I don't know if it's a coincidence, but as a kid, I'm getting into those things at the same time as I'm spending my pocket money on Firebird games for the Spectrum for £1.99, which I'm also getting from the corner shop or the newsagents. So at the same time, you've got the rise of the old 8-bit computers. So perhaps the kids or the young adults who would have been pursuing this kind of stuff for escapism, the whole variety of things that you can get into. How much time do you spend reading these books?
No, because by then you could have your Atari, your Commodore 64, your Castle Wolfenstein, and don't forget Zork.
Well, I was a fucking nerdy kid, so I was reading these things, and I was also burying myself in Elite and the Spectrum for hours and hours and hours on end. So I think there's a coincidence there. There's also the point where I think, the people who discovered Moorcock through space rock, through Hawkwind and things like that, through the counterculture is basically dead.
That fell apart. I mean, everybody cut their hair and put on a different kind of jacket and call themselves a punk. So I think there's a sweet spot in the 70s where Moorcock is still riding high on the new wave thing. He's writing articles for New Statesman. He's writing in things like The Guardian from time to time. Angus Nye, who was a big
Guardian writer is still a strong proponent of his work. But it's also at that point where the interest in that kind of stuff is starting to tail off just while he is maturing. Because it's easy to forget, really, that he's maturing in the 70s at that point. By that point, he's probably written 40 books.
Yes.
And he's still only 36.
Yes.
Or 37.
It reminds me of, it's like that German director, Werner Fassbinder. And he died at 36 of an overdose. He'd made 50 films by then.
Yeah.
Seen 40 of them.
Yeah.
But the thing about Moorcock that's interesting to me, and I'm going to tie it back into, Warlord of the Air and the other books, is, and I was trying to think about what was the wide point I wanted to make about what we were going to discuss, and I think we're going to have to do the actual book readings probably remotely.
Yeah, absolutely.
But what occurred to me in the main, when you read them in the omnibus edition, you're reading two books that were written, I believe, in the early 70s, and then the third one, The Steel Tsar, written or published at least in 1981.
Yeah.
And when I read those three books, as I just did again last year, I'm very struck by the thematic unity is quite good. He carries the theme properly across almost a decade of publishing. But you can see, to me, from the first book I feel is written, it's the Warlord of the Air's qualities to me that I enjoy are that kind of feeling you have, that even Ballard did this in certain extents. He brings that feeling of aviation, the morning flight, the fog and the dew on a cold airstrip with the sun coming up and starting to cut through, and the sort of joy of going aloft. Yeah. And I know this feeling from having flown in small aircraft. Yeah. We're going to any airport, there's a feeling like this, like the day could bring anything. Yeah. And, and then that somehow that is over by noon, like this is the magic hour. He puts that feeling in the book. Yeah. He also gives, now that I've been to India and spent about a decade over there doing this and that, he does get a quite good sense of the kind of the Western Orientalists' fear and terror at the thing that he supposedly controls, but there are older forces. Yeah. He doesn't make it too hokey. He's very good about that feeling of the terror of the mountains. Yeah. It's wonderful. I haven't been in the Himalayas, but I flew once from Guwahati to New Delhi, and so you go right under the southern edge of these mountains, and I saw Everest from the airplane, and I was thinking Bastable, because I was thinking, finally, I'm seeing these mountains, and even from up here at 35,000 feet, holy cow! Yeah. They're not just magnificent, they're terrifying. And so when I went back and read The Warlord, I thought he's got that feeling in there. So I will say, great sense of atmosphere and place in the first book. Second book, sometimes I wonder if he wrote it earlier than the first book. I feel like the writing quality is diminished in some way. He has some excellent battle scenes, and he's very good at certain points at doing the step-by-step of a battle. In this case, it's the air battle over the Atlantic. And what he does well in that is showing that how slow moving it is, because these are airships. It's not like Tora or Midway, with Spitfires and whatever. My father would kill me if I get the name of the airplanes wrong. He was in the Air Force. But it's not like that. These are slow moving ships that are trying to maneuver and do battle in some weird way. It's quite medieval, but I don't like the writing quality of the second book. I feel that he goes far too much into that kind of a grimmer version of H. Rider Haggard, is that his name? Or, Alistair MacLean. Yeah. And I'm sorry to say, but his portrayal of the American characters in Washington, D.C. and here and there, it's I don't want to say incorrect. He does the version of the American actor acting in a British production who speaks in a general sort of British accent that's from here and there. That part sounded like it came from Exeter. That next word sounded like it came from Carlisle, vaguely Cockney for a second, right? Yeah. His writing, his dialogue in the mouths of Americans comes off to me like that's exactly what an English author would think an American would say. And it's not just that, but the writing quality in a sense feels rushed. Yeah. But when you look at The Steel Tsar and you read that book, it's a vast advance in tone.
Yeah.
It's a sadder book. It's also more emotionally removed. The irony is heavy. He's clearly been catching up on his buddy Ballard's books, who also developed in this time that voice of his, which is quite cold and remote, but at the same time, there's a strange compassion in there. I mean, The Steel Tsar is all about genocide, and mass murder. And he tells it in a way that is surprisingly entertaining because he cuts out the emotion and the heat. He just presents the way a reporter would do.
Yeah.
Roe Island, the air crash, the lawlessness in the town, the drunken Dutch and English people who are hanging around waiting for the end, and then later in Russia. And he, of course, has that incredibly wonderful and unforgettable, awful character whose name I don't remember, but that British twit who manages to survive through just about every situation complaining.
Yeah.
The one who builds the Tsar.
Yeah.
I thought it was just left.
Yeah. We will get to these in good time, and you're right. We'll look at Warlord of the Air in more detail in a more focused episode, I think. But yeah, Warlord was written in the late 60s, where he's definitely an ideas man, and he's honing his craft. I think The Land Leviathan probably sits squarely in that period where he's writing books in 3 days, probably on speed, typing pages, throwing them over the shoulder to his mate, and just rattling this stuff out.
And I just imagine him saying, yeah, we'll keep it.
yeah, absolutely. But yeah, so we will reconvene remotely to do these things. But in the meantime, we mentioned Woodhouse, and of course, what we tend to generally do is whenever we record an episode, is we send our spares out of books that we've read to a lucky patron demon. And actually, you are a patron
I am a
demon.
patron demon.
You are indeed. And actually, I think it would be absolutely appropriate and wrong of me to not send you away with some Moorcock books to carry around Europe. So we've got Coming of the Terrifiers, which of course are two parts so far with Miles.
I have heard about it, and I've never read it.
Well, we've talked about Doctor Who, we've talked about P.G. Woodhouse, we've talked about Moorcock, all three in there.
It's like Rocky Road ice cream.
Yeah. The second one is with Liam. Recently, we covered the Moorcock collection before Armageddon.
Oh, delightful. Thank you.
And as a slight advance on the next episode that's due to come out, Pisces Rising by Peter Cave, which Graham and I discussed last week, and that'll be the next episode that comes out. So there you go, some books to lug around Europe.
Fathoms deep they lay in wait. These sea creatures man had exploited for so long. This is not a Gunter Grass novel.
It certainly isn't.
Suck it, Tin Drum.
It has sent us down a Peter Cave rabbit hole of pulp goodness.
It's wonderful. I'm going to Bristol after I leave here.
Yeah.
And then on to London for a few weeks and then down to Berlin. I am going to knock these out one after the other. I was reading The History of the Franks by Gregory of Tours, which, by the way, if you want to know what people were doing to each other in grisly ways just after the fall of the Roman Empire, that's your book. It
sounds amazing.
Very entertaining.
Allow me to drag those brows down.
Yes, I can feel the cortisone already working.
Well, you know what? Thank you. Finally, we cooked it up in a coffee shop. So yeah, it's getting quite noisy in here. So it's probably a good time to stop. But we will reconvene. Well, we're going to reconvene tonight for a curry.
May I ask one more question?
Of course.
Regarding somebody who's a contributor to your show.
Yeah.
Mal Pertwee. Isn't that a name I hear?
Oh, of course. Yeah. One of our patrons.
I have to
For some reason, because when we're talking about Doctor Who, I was thinking, are they related to John Pertwee?
Oh, so this has always been my question. Mal, are you holding back on us?
No, Mal Pertwee. Malpurtuis. Or is it Pertuis? So it's a literary reference.
He's Mal Pertwee. So I figured he was from the Norman Pertwee.
No,
the ones who came over.
I was thinking, yeah, Sean Pertwee's brother. Yeah, Malcolm Pertwee. No.
Oh, well. That's all right. We love you anyway, Mal.
Yeah, we love you, Mal Pertwee. She's in America as well, by the way. But she's been one of our patrons for probably a good
Quite
4 years now. Yeah, one of our earliest patrons. So thank you, Mal. Sister of John.
There we are.
We'll catch up for a curry later on, and we will re-hook up remotely to talk about Warlord of the Air in more detail.
Sounds like a plan.
Thank you very much.
Great
And
to be
also
here.
talk about your writing and your other projects.
My artificial intelligence music.
Yeah. We'll get to that next time. Thanks again. massive thanks to Robert for persevering and hanging out on his last day in Bradford and talking Moorcock and more. Robert is a reporter and editor for Reuters and author of Haiku 61 Revisited, The Songs of Bob Dylan Interpreted as Haiku, and novel The History Student, and coming soon his second novel, I Knew Him Before He Was Famous, and we'll talk about that next time we hook up. You can find Haiku 61 and The History Student in the usual book places, and we'll talk about them more too next time we meet up with him. And thanks to Clarky the Cruel for the invite to his birthday bash and afternoon mini gaming con too. We had a Super Gamer Troika, care of Becky, aka Dragon Girl 71, and it was Phil's first ever time gaming outside of our kitchen with friends, and she had a fabulous time. And thanks as always to our patrons for keeping the show on the road. First, those without tier: Anthony Paconti, Tim Cardos, Dave Dempster, and Sebastian Weetabix. And our Chaos engineers Ed Von Stout, Andrew Cicluna, Andrew Spong, Andrew Van Ness, Anthony Porter, Benjamin Fletcher, Brandon Mays, Dan Charnley, Dave Griffiths, Dave Voxman, Gabriel Laycock, Harvey Faulkner Aston, Jim Kirkland, Jim Jupp, John W. Lays, Jules Lawrence, Mal Pertwee. Now, as we mentioned you earlier, Mal Pertwee, I should point out that your handle is from the 1940s Gothic horror novel by Jean Ray, also the subject of a 1971 film adaptation featuring Orson Welles that the BBC described as bizarre, lurid and baffling. And it is not short for Malcolm Pertwee. Thanks for your support. And to Matt Saltz, Nick Hopkinson, Urfa Ziv, Paul McRandall, PJ Cooper, Scott Butler, Simon Perrins, and of course our crafty Jugaderos, Christian Hundal, Graham Holden, Liam Turner, Loz, Mark Taylor, Matthew Broom, Sean Twist, Toby White and Taylor Lavery. An eternal thanks to our patron demons, Alistair Davison, Andy Clark, happy birthday again Clarky, Andy Darby, Dave Lee, Fred Quiche, Gareth Wilson, Glenn Sawyer, great to meet you at Clarky's 50th bash Glenn, and thanks for the lifts too. Greg Faulkner, Gwen Barlow, Ian Stead, another recent birthday, happy birthday Ian, Imria, Janie Stim, Jason Vogel, Joe Monty, Jonathan Sharp, Lee Gary, Mark Hebden, Marius Latauskas, Miles Reed-Labato, Neil Burton, Paul Hillary, Randall Gatlin, Steve Round, Tom Murphy, Tony Malazzo, the OG patron Norman Beresford, and last but never least, well, Robert MacMillan, again. Right, enough of my blather. Don't forget you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram with the handle @BreakfastRuins. You can email us at breakfastruins@outlook.com. The webpage is breakfastintheruins.com. BITR Breakfast in the Ruins Radio is live on Radio Garden or via the web player at breakfastintheruinsradio.blogspot.com. We have our Patreon page too, and there are a few extra odds and sods on there. But for now, take care, stay safe, and we will meet again soon on the Moonbeam Roads.